Does Irish paganism have goddesses of fate or destiny? Well, Dagdi Agus Falcha, hi, hello, and welcome. This is a cast or question we have received from Kelly, who was wondering. I was chatting with my partner, a Norse pagan, about the Norn, the women who weave a person's life and the ultimate fate when they were born. My question is, do the Irish stories have something similar? I know the Great Queen, referring to the Mórrígan, of course, can see the future, but that's not the same as fate. Well, it's a really interesting question. It's quite a fascinating one to explore, and I have had some good fun doing so already. So, Gaurav Mahagas, thank you for the cast. Um, essentially, in many different pantheons around the world or belief structures, there is this idea of predestination or a destiny written in the stars or by the fates or the Norns. So we have, of course, the Norns, the goddesses who weave the skein of someone's life by the time that they're born, which then sets out the length it's going to be. And essentially, it's on them to deliver what they need to in order to access the afterlife, be it Valhalla or hell. Now, in the Greek pantheons, we have the Fates, which is again similar to the Norse. There is these three deities, these three goddesses who weave and watch and define the destiny of someone before they are actually incarnate. But then also they're the ones who make sure that when it's time to go, they cut the line, and that then leads to that person to their afterlife in the underworld, aka Hades. Now, Irish paganism and Irish gods is a little bit different. And this is where it was a really interesting question to explore because in order to answer this question in a little bit of depth and detail, um, we have to talk about death. We have to talk about the afterlife. And when we get into that from an Irish context, things don't really seem to stick. And so, neat answer, not hard to say. No, there are no goddesses or gods or deities or functionaries who define and declare fate or destiny in the same context as you would have the Norns or the Fates. Um, and then I asked, of course, the question why? Like, why would there not be? Like, it's understood. Like, even the Egyptians have Osiris, the undying god, and they have, the journey into the life beyond life, where they carry over, their blessings essentially and their wealth, and which is why we have their funerary customs the way they are defined. When we look around Celtic nations, or now again, Celtic nations isn't countries, it's kind of or language or genetics. It is an expression or a collective term for people who conform to a certain linguistic structure. But when we look across, say, like Western Europe, for death rituals and people passing on, there are people who are buried with items and buried with like the functions of their life so that they can have their life in the other world, much like in the Norse tradition. We have somewhat of that in the Irish context, but not in the same way when we talk about gods and deities, because there is no god of death. There is no god of death in the Irish structure. Like we do have death messengers, death omens, and the banshee, the black coach, the black dog. There's many different things that signify and indicate a death is going to happen, but there is no deity who functions as a ruler over an underworld because Irish paganism doesn't have an underworld. It has an otherworld. And this is a fundamental kind of shift, which maybe indicates some of the mentality we have around it, because the other world is known as An Sail Ella, which is literally the other life. It is not a place of death. It is not a mortuary, a sepulchre. It is not a hellscape. It is literally another reality, another existence, which happens to be parallel to ours. And it doesn't stay static. It's not bound in amber or anything like that at all. It is a living, functioning place outside of our reality. Now, there are places in the Irish otherworld which do deal with death and with crossing over. So we have, okay, so we have a number of different stories in our mythology and in our practices which talk about people journeying into the other world alive and coming back. From Octra Nera, one of our oldest ones, to the Voyages of Bran, all of these talk about a hero who goes off in a boat, passes through a mist, and enters into the other world. Now, it doesn't always have to be on a boat. Sometimes we have stories, even more modern, closer to our time frame stories of bards or like drunk people or people just living their life, stepping on a stray sod, walking through a mist, falling asleep on a mound, which happens to be a fairy mound or an otherworld access, and then stumbling into the other world and having experiences and coming back. So those people invariably don't die, but they exist in the other world and come back from it. Auctioneer is a great example of this because he goes into the other world at Samhain, leaving the court of Queen Maeve and Alil. He then spends a year or more in the other world. And when he comes back, when he finally managed to escape, because he's kind of trapped there, he escapes and finds that for all of the time that has passed with him in the other world, only an hour or two has gone since he left that same fireplace meeting with Maeve and Alil. He then knows what's going to happen in the future because he has existed through that time and he's able to tell Maeve and Alil as such, which then leads to the rising of a host and the burning of the Shia Cruachan, the mounds in Cruachan to destroy the access to the other world. So when we deal with this concept of the other world, it's not a life after death. It is a place that is parallel to our existence, which means that when someone does die in our world, there are places in the other world where they can go temporarily, because part of Irish paganism is the transmigration of spirit, which means you come back. So there is the stories of Teach Donn, which is the House of the Dead, which isn't again this mortuary or sepulchre or anything like that at all. It is literally like a hostel. It's a stopping over place where you go and you rest, and then if you're choosing to head on further into the other world to explore that place, or if you're choosing to come back, it is the go-between place in many ways. There's also a reference to resting in the Summerlands. So it's this talk of this particular place where a spirit, having left our mortal world, goes and actually has a rest in lands that are ever summer. Now, it's not Tir na Nog. Tir na Nog is another place in the other world where a person goes and lives to be ever youthful, as we see with Uiscin, the son of Fionn McCool. He goes across the waves on a white horse and lives in Tir na Nog, has children, and sees them growing up, and he has his life there. And it's only when he decides to come back on the horse he realizes that centuries has passed. So time is not as relevant or not as defined when it comes to the existence of people in our world and in the other world from an Irish tradition perspective, which means death also is not a big deal because, the belief is that, yeah, okay, you may die, but, the parts that are internal within you are going to go to the other world, go on a journey, and then eventually make their way back anyway. So we don't have a god that oversees that. Now, side reference, the Dagda is known to have the power over life and death when he takes up the club, which gives him that ability on top of his many other abilities. One of the Dagda's epithets is Dagda Dawn, which connects him to Teach Donn, House of the Dead. Um, but again, he's not a god. He's not like Hades. He doesn't like rule over the realm of the dead in any way, shape, or form. We don't have that. Now, where does this leave us in an idea of fate and destiny then? So we don't have predetermined fates and destiny, but you mentioned the Mórrígan as a question, and Mórrígan being able to see and prophesize the future, but it's not a passive, she's able to be aware of it. She actually defines it. She's an active influence in steering the direction of reality. The whole Tombo Julia that we see in the Ulster cycle, the cattle raid of Cooley, the reason why those cows exist is because in a previous story or a rave scale, a before story, the Morrigan brings a cow out of the other world to have it covered in our world so that the invariably Dun Cúailnge, the brown cow, can be born. So she's not some passive observer. The Morrigan is tweaking and flowing and forming reality to try and make sure things happen the way they really should happen or to the best advantage. Um, how is that defined? I suppose another talk, a different day on the Morrigan. So we don't have someone who just passively observes fate or passively observes destiny. The Morrigan, as I said, is an active influence when it comes to defining the way things are supposed to go or things should go. So, do we have anything that helps to deal with this idea of fate and destiny? Um, we do, and it's ever so slightly different to, well, actually, no, it's quite remarkably different to anything else you're going to see in Norse or Greek or anything like that at all. It's not a predefined, this is the way it's just going to be. What we have are known as geis or gassa. Now, a geis is singular, gassa is plural, and it's like a spiritual prohibition. Another word that people may use is taboo. It is something that a person would have observed about them when they're very young, which then leads to be a defining factor upon them for the rest of their life. And if they breach or violate this gesh, or again, if they have multiple, a gyasa, or all of the gyasa, then invariably it leads to either death or ruin or destruction. It leads to absolute obliteration. But it's not a particular god or goddess or deity who oversees this function. It is pretty much sovereignty and the other world itself. So all of these Gesh are empowered by the other world, by this Sail Ella, this other life. And it's by violating the taboos in this life that you're almost held accountable by the other world or the powers outside of this life. And we see this in a number of different ways. There is a story, probably the most famous one is the Derrick's Hostel, where the son of Concover MacNassa, Cormac, is summoned to come back to Ulster and rule as king from Connacht. He then goes on his journey to return to Ulster, but he's not the man fit for the job, and he's tested on the way back. And every single one of his gassa is placed before him, and he breaks it. He violates every single one of them, which then leads to his arrival in Dá Derega's hostel, or this kind of red otherworldly place where he sees like the Redmouth Bive, he sees the Dagda, he has all of these visions of failed kings and ruin, and that essentially does lead to him and his demise because he breaks all of the rules he's not supposed to break. So another famous example is, of course, Cuchulainn, who had a geis against him to eat dog meat but that didn't come when he was born. That came when he took on the name Cuchulainn, because he was Setanta Sultan first, and it's only later on where Coffa, a druid, has a view of a possible future where the name Cuchulainn will be remembered forever, and then Setanta says, "Okay, well, I'll take that name on." But at the same time as he took on the role or took on the power and providence that would come with the name, he also earned a geis, which was to never eat dog meat, which is one thing that he later on does break, which does lead to his eventual demise and death. So the idea of fate and destiny as defined in other religions and other practices doesn't exist in the same context when it comes to Irish paganism. A, possibly because we don't have the same view as death or the afterlife as other religions or other pantheons or spiritualities would, but also the idea that your fate and your destiny is not some remote thing that is set for you and that's just the way it's going to be. It's that you yourself need to move within this idea of right relationship, then keeping in connection with the land, the sovereignty of the world itself, and also the other world on Sail Ella, knowing that that's where you will go and come back from when your time is done here. So the idea then of Gesh and Gassa coming in, they're not this how can I put it? It's not like a predefined thing that is just invariably going to happen. It is almost like a spiritual stopgap. It's this kind of pressure valve for those who have a lot of ability or a lot of potential to do a lot of things to make sure that there is some kind of balance maintained on them so that they don't exceed or go beyond or, twist the way of the world out of shape. Um, Now I realize I'm speaking a little bit obliquely around it because in a lot of cases when we hear stories about Gesh and Gyasa, it's not, oh, here's this really cool thing like that's a spiritual prohibition on me because of a god, deity, guardian, otherworld, ancestor, or whatever. It's like, here's that thing you're not supposed to fucking do. And invariably, it's only mentioned in the stories when someone fucking breaks it and doesn't do what they're supposed to do. So, if you ever come across someone who's volunteering their gesh or gyasa to you, it probably means they don't have a really good understanding of it because we actually have stories where I think it's. Yeah, I think it's Deirdre and Nisha. Deirdre and Nisha are fleeing from the other world. Oh, sorry, are fleeing from Ulster and being pursued by Concover. But Diarmaid's foster father is one of the great heroes, Fergus, and so he's protecting them, and no one can touch them because Fergus is protecting. But it's known to some that Fergus has a geis on him, which means he cannot refuse an invitation to a party to stay over. And so they stop at a place, they have rest. Deirdre and Nisha are up early the next morning. They're like, listen, we have to stay on the road. We have to stay ahead of Concover and his forces. But Concover had sent message ahead of them. And so Fergus is invited to stay for a feast that night. And of course, his geis is he cannot refuse. And so that night he has to stay, which means removes Fergus's protection, and Deirdre and Nisha are captured by Concover and his forces. So invariably, when we talk about these geis or gassa, it's when someone breaks with them that they are actually mentioned. And so knowing someone's geis or knowing someone's gassa is a powerful kind of enough thing in a certain context because the violation of the geis and gassa isn't just, oh, well, you're going to get a rap on the knuckles. It's like you are fucked, your life is pretty much over, or it's going to lead to ruin. So that is the other aspect. That's the only other aspect I could really think of when I was studying this question from Kelly, about fates and the defining of destiny in those ways, because that's the other aspect we see when we're talking about Norns or we're talking about the fates in Norse paganism or Greek paganism. But from an Irish point of view, the answer, not hard to say, we don't have goddesses of fate and destiny in that same way. We do have the otherworld influences, goddesses of sovereignty, which are many in many ways. And the roles and relationships that we have with life and with death are quite different when it comes to the Irish expression of things. And so, yeah, I think that is the best I can do to answer that question. It could be down to the fact that we don't have another an afterlife thing the same way other oh, actually, there's probably something to mention as well. A lot of our content and a lot of the older stories we have were written down by early Christian monks, and so there may have been older stories that existed in oral tradition that we know we don't have anymore because our culture was targeted and eradicated by multiple like centuries of colonization and oppression. So the oldest stories may have been held back. Some of the stories or information may have been held back from these Christian monks when they were writing it down, or even if they were told, maybe they didn't write it fully because actually one of the references, and I've seen this myself in the manuscript leading to Teach Donn, it's only mentioned at the end of a manuscript written by a monk, and he puts a small paragraph in scathingly about this place where heathens go when they die, this place Teach Donn in the other world that they talk about, but it's where those terrible pagan people go, and anyone else will be welcomed into the divine heavens and blah blah blah. So like it's possible we don't have information, and that's a sadness to this whole circumstance. But where we are now, with all the information we have available, we don't have a god of death. We don't have an afterlife in the same context. Everything is about the transmigration of spirit. Even the gods themselves, who are said to have died and been slain, do turn up in later cycles because the other world is not bound by the same time frames that we've seen clearly in the narratives. The Mórrígan being able to define an active influence in how reality is being steered and how everything's going isn't some passive judge or like prophesizing individual. Um, and I think I have began to loop all the way back around and revisit all the information all over again. But yeah, Kelly, thank you very much for the question. I really do appreciate it. Very grateful for it. It's a fascinating way to explore these kind of narratives and to answer these things means I have to put my own thoughts in order and go and make sure I'm checking my references when I do. Speaking of references, we have a whole year's worth of free content available, irishpagan.school/free. And if you have a cast or question that you would like answered, please feel free to let us know wherever you are seeing this or hearing this, because it's an opportunity for me to speak to it and do some more study on it myself if I don't have answers straight off the top of the head. Until next time, look after yourself, take care, and Gurav Mahagat. Slán. Goodbye.